Hi, Jamie Cowen here to talk to you today about will this be another Tisha B'Av event in Israel? What is Tisha B'Av? It means the ninth of the Hebrew month Av, which occurs sometime between July and August. This year, it's July 27. Tisha B'Av is a day of fasting to remember and mourn over tragic events in Jewish history. Both the first and second temples were destroyed on that day. The expulsion of Jews from Spain also occurred on Tisha B'Av, as well as other tragic events. So it's a day associated with sadness, grief, and prayer. Since the miraculous restoration of Israel in modern times, Tisha B'Av hasn't played much of a role in the Jewish world. The cry at the end of the Passover Seder next year in Jerusalem was fulfilled for many Jews who have migrated to the Promised Land in the last 75 years. Why remember the destruction of the temples and the expulsion from Spain when Jews are finally back in their homeland? Well, we've all heard the phrase, what goes around comes around. I fear we could be at a comes around moment. I want to share a passage from the prophet Zechariah. It's about Tisha B'Av. Allow me to give some background. Zechariah prophesied during the building of the Second Temple. He lived around 520 BC. Jews had recently returned from the Babylonian exile and were living under Persian rule. There had been some disputes about rebuilding Jerusalem and the temple. Zechariah prophesied that the temple would be rebuilt under Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest. In Zechariah chapter 7, as the rebuilding is taking place, some of the inhabitants of the land wanted to know if they should still mourn on Tisha B'Av, since the mourning was over the destruction of the first temple and the building of the second temple had commenced. They asked this question, shall I weep and abstain, fast, as I have done these many years? Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, say to all the people of the land and to the priests, when you fasted and mourned in the 5th and 7th months, these 70 years, was it actually for me that you fasted? The reference to fasting in the 5th month is Tisha B'Av. But then the prophet continues, are not these the words which the Lord proclaimed by the former prophets when Jerusalem was inhabited and prosperous along with its cities around it? Then the word of the Lord came to Zechariah, saying, thus has the Lord of hosts said, dispense true justice and practice kindness and compassion, each to his brother, and do not oppress the widow or the orphan or the stranger or the poor, and do not devise evil in your hearts against one another. But they refused to pay attention and turned a stubborn shoulder and stopped their hearts from hearing. They made their hearts like flint. Therefore great wrath came from the Lord of hosts, and I scattered them with a storm wind among all the nations. It appears from the text that judgment came upon the nation because justice, kindness, and compassion were neglected and replaced with oppression against the lowly, the downtrodden, and the stranger. When Israel was formed as a modern nation, it began with these amazing words from her Declaration of Independence. The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all of its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions, and it will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Like the Declaration of Independence to the United States, Israel's declaration was made before a real government even existed. After Israel's War of Independence, a provisional government was formed to establish a permanent government. One of its charges was to form a constitution. For a variety of reasons, it was never done. Rather, a set of basic laws were set in place over time that constituted a type of constitution, including the basic law on human dignity and liberty that stipulates rights similar to those embodied in the Bill of Rights to the U.S. Constitution. Shortly after the enactment of the Basic Law on Human Dignity and Liberty, the Israeli Supreme Court ruled that it had the power of judicial review. In other words, the power to review laws passed by the Israeli legislature, the Knesset, to ensure that they complied with the principles of the basic laws. This is exactly what the U.S. Supreme Court did very early on in its U.S. constitutional history. Essentially, judicial review provides checks and balances in a governing system to prevent any one group from assuming almost dictatorial powers by judging and ruling on actions that may transgress the very character of the country. Herein lies the rub. Over the past 30 years, the court has struck down certain laws and decisions by the government, particularly important to the religious community and right-wing nationalist groups. For years, these communities have wanted to curb the court's power. With the ascension to power of a coalition government comprised solely of religious and right-wing national parties, the current government saw its opening to strip the courts of power to review its decisions, thus allowing it to pass almost anything it wanted. Immediately after this current government's formation this past winter, they announced they would seek to curb judicial review. This set off months of protests, threats, negotiations, and strikes. The fear among a likely majority of Israelis is that individual rights will be trampled on by an extremist government and that the character of the country will be forever changed. The first step to do so occurred this week on July 24th. The governing coalition passed legislation stripping the court's power to strike down government decisions based on what is known as the reasonableness doctrine. The reasonableness doctrine was utilized by the court to review government decisions to determine if they were reasonable in light of larger society-wide principles. What in part drove the government to make this change was the appointment of the thrice criminally convicted Aryeh Deri of the ultra-Orthodox Shas party to be a minister in the current government. Current law prohibits anyone convicted of a crime of moral turpitude from serving in government for 7 years. Deri was convicted of fraud and jailed for 3 years in the 1990s. Thus, he was barred by law for serving in the government for 7 years. After the 7-year period, he again entered the political arena and served in various governments. More recently, he was convicted again of fraudulent crimes, but in a plea bargain, the prosecution agreed to drop the charges of the crimes of moral turpitude with the understanding that he would leave the political world. Once that agreement was reached, he again sought political office and was appointed by the current government to be a minister. Upon appeal, the Israeli Supreme Court struck down the appointment just a few months ago, claiming it was unreasonable in the extreme. The decision enraged the governing coalition and led to the newly passed law. Members of the governing coalition have declared this is just the beginning. Their goal is to restrict the jurisdiction of the court. Unlike almost all other democratic countries, the courts in Israel are the only real check on government abuse. Without the courts, how will the grand statements of Israel's Declaration of Independence be granted? That the country will be based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. Worse, remember the Lord's words through the prophet Zechariah concerning Tisha B'Av long ago. Dispense true justice and practice kindness and compassion, each to his brother, and do not oppress the widow or the orphan, the stranger or the poor, and do not devise evil in your hearts against one another. Because these things were ignored then, terrible calamities came upon the people. Tisha B'Av services remember and mourn the tragedies that fell upon the Jewish people that often coincided with this day. And here we are again, on the eve of Tisha B'Av. Will this be another Tisha B'Av event? During Tisha B'Av services, the book of Lamentations is chanted. The book of Lamentations was written by the prophet Jeremiah following the destruction of the first temple. I will close with some of Jeremiah's best known words from Lamentations. I have been deprived of peace. I have forgotten what prosperity is. So I say, my splendor is gone, and all that I had hoped from the Lord. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and my soul, yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Lord, let it be. See you next time.